Over the course of automotive history, there have been a number of vehicles that one might label trendsetters from a design perspective. And while there certainly are a number of trend-setting designs from the 1930s and 40s, and yes, even the 1980s, there are quite a few vehicles within the 1950s to 1970s in particular that stand out from a design standpoint, that really set the tone and direction for where automotive design was headed in the coming years. This video aims to pick 5 designs from that time period that set the trend from a style perspective, and it's admittedly a hard task, as many vehicles during this time were quite beautiful and certainly set trends going forward. Nonetheless, we will endeavor to share a few examples with you of design trendsetters from the 1950s to 1970s. Let's begin in chronological order with the 1957 Plymouth lineup. Plymouth had historically been number 3 in vehicle sales, dating all the way back to 1932. However, by 1955, Buick had stolen its third-place spot on the podium by selling 738,000 units that year compared to 705,000 for Plymouth. This did not go unnoticed by Chrysler leadership, and Chrysler President Tex Colbert made it a personal mission to get Plymouth back into the number 3 spot. The result was one of the most radically styled lineups in history. When introduced in 1957, Plymouth touted the 1957 models as futuristic by declaring, suddenly, it's 1960. And there was more than a modicum of veracity in that statement. The 1957 Plymouth lineup was so radical that it set both General Motors and Ford back on their heels, to the point that General Motors decided, after its design leadership had saw the Plymouths parked outside of the Detroit assembly plants, that they needed to melt and repour their entire 1959 model year lineup for fear that Chrysler Corporation styling was just so advanced compared to what they were proposing that their existing vehicle proposals weren't going to cut it in the marketplace. Aside from prominent tail fins, Virgil Exner's styling team developed a number of firsts on the 1957 Plymouths, including the so-called quad headlight look, despite the fact that many states in 1957 had not yet allowed more than one headlight on either side of each vehicle. And they got around this rule by making the inboard light the turn signal. The 57 Plymouths also introduced Chrysler's new torsion-air suspension with torsion bars up front and leaf springs in the rear. It worked phenomenally well if you wanted a car that perhaps didn't have the best ride, but certainly had the best handling of the big 3 vehicles. The torsion bar setup up front, coupled with reduced height air cleaners and intake manifolds, allowed the front end of these 1957 Plymouths to be especially low and sleek. And buyers could choose from numerous engines under hood, all the way up to the top dog, 290 horsepower, 318 cubic inch Fury V800 V8. And while there certainly were some great engines and transmissions under hood, it was really the looks of the 1957 Plymouth that set the trend for a number of years to come in Detroit-era styling. Let's move on to number 2, the 1961 Lincoln Continental. After the oddly styled 1958-60 Lincolns flopped in the marketplace, the division was really running on fumes, and then Ford President Robert S. McNamara, the first Ford president outside of the Ford family, had thoughts of killing off Lincoln to improve the company's overall profitability. However, he was thankfully convinced to keep the division once a proposal was made to create the Lincoln range out of a stretched Ford Thunderbird chassis. There was also only one model for 1961 in the Lincoln lineup, and that was the Continental. This Continental rode atop a 123-inch wheelbase that was 8 inches shorter than its predecessor, and the car overall was about 15 inches shorter than the 1960 model. It would also arguably become the pinnacle of designer Elwood Engel's achievements throughout his lifetime, as this 1961 Continental and its Bauhausian design style, with very slab sides and simple, clean forms, set a tone for American car styling that just hadn't been seen to this point, and one that was emulated quite significantly not only by General Motors, but also by Chrysler, once Engel was hired to replace Virgil Exner in 1962. he was largely hired because of his reputation and association with the 61 Continental. And to further demonstrate just how seminal this 1961 Continental was, there are at least two vehicles that General Motors produced subsequent to the 61 Continental's introduction that took their direct inspiration from the car. The first was the 1963 Pontiac Grand Prix, and you can note here its distinctively clean body sides. And the second was the 1965 Cadillac, which also bore similarly clean body sides, breaking from the 1964 and previous generations that had some extreme, shall we say, sculpture to the overall body side sections of the cars. Of course, when Engel ported over to Chrysler in 1962, the Chrysler lineup from the mid-60s, in particular the 1964 Imperial, bore a lot more than a passing resemblance to the 61 Continental, no doubt because then Chrysler styling chief Elwood Engel had his thumbprints on this 61 Continental. Overall, the 61 Continental was really quite an amazing vehicle. It did come standard with a 430 cubic inch V8 that amazingly only came with a 2-barrel carburetor in 1961, and it did ride atop a unibody chassis similar to the 1958 through 60 versions. And yet, while the mechanicals were quite good, it again was the styling of the 61 Continental that made it a most remarkable piece in automotive history. Let's move on to the number 3 car in our top 5 countdown, and that is the 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. After the success of the 1963 Buick Riviera, another beautiful design that admittedly didn't make this list, as well as the Ford Thunderbird, Oldsmobile was left craving its own personal luxury, sporty car. It arrived for the 1966 model year not only with trend-setting styling, but also with very unique mechanicals under hood that represented many firsts for General Motors. The exterior styling of the 1966 Toronado was penned by a design team that included Dave North, whose famous flame red car rendering helped form the basis of the car. As the design took shape, the Toronado came to life with beautifully sculpted, larger-than-life fender flares that formed the basis of its principal design theme. The Toronado forced these forms into vogue, as well as the lack of a shoulder on the upper section of the body. The wheel flares themselves would be copied on many other domestic and foreign vehicles, even as late as some late-model Audis. The front end of the Toronado also put a unique face on this vehicle, and the design team endowed the Toronado with a front end that had a longer front overhang than the Tornado's sister car, the Buick Riviera, with which the Toronado shared a windshield and side glass. The Toronado would also share a fair bit of mechanicals with the later 1967 Cadillac Eldorado, including the turbohydromatic 425 transmission, which was effectively a turbohydromatic 400 rear-wheel drive transmission that was split after the torque converter and had the transmission portion driven by a Morse High-Vo chain. This allowed the Toronado to become General Motors' first mass-produced front-wheel drive vehicle, with the engine and transmission in a longitudinal orientation. And while some were nervous about the reliability of this front-wheel drive setup, the Tornado's engine and transmission were used almost unaltered in the 1970s-era GMC motorhomes, proving how robust the engine and transmission combinations really were. And in the 1966 model year to that point, the Toronado did receive Oldsmobile's top engine, a 385 horsepower premium fuel 425 cubic inch V8. It endowed the Toronado with not necessarily neck-snapping acceleration, but certainly strong power, with 0 to 60 coming in about 8.5 seconds on these vehicles, which was quite respectable for the time and for a 4,000-pound-plus car. Let's move on to the next vehicle in this series, and that is the 1967 Cadillac Eldorado, a sister car to this Toronado that we just discussed. Arriving late to the personal luxury car and sportier car party, Cadillac wanted its own entry, similar to the Buick Riviera and the Oldsmobile Toronado, and in 1967, it came out with its first front-wheel drive Eldorado that shared a number of components with the Toronado, including, as I mentioned, the turbohydromatic 425 transmission, as well as the Buick Riviera. The The Eldorado's styling marked a significant departure of Cadillacs from previous generation, including the extremely cleanly styled 1965 and 66 Cadillacs, which, as previously mentioned, were a response to the 1961 Lincoln Continental. This 1967 Eldorado was replete with creased bodywork all over the car, and it did so in part because General Motors' then styling chief, Bill Mitchell, believed that a personal luxury car like the Cadillac Eldorado should have creases just like the crease in the center of a man's pants. The 1967 and 68 Cadillac Eldorado would also be the only Cadillacs in history that have used hidden headlights, at least in production form. The 67 front end was also unique, in part because in the 1968 model year, due to complaints about the fitment of the cast plug ahead of the front fender, Cadillac moved the turn signal from the bumper up into the front fender to eliminate this complaint and do so in a functional way. The 67 Eldorado was a seminal car for Cadillac as it emphasized that Cadillac from that point forward was really going to have this crease in the pants type styling for many years to come. In fact, it was the 1967 Eldorado which inspired the so-called art and science theme that Cadillac revived in the early 2000s with the CTS, the SRX, among other vehicles. So its design influence was quite profound. Under hood, the 1967 Eldorado had a 1 year only in this vehicle, 429 cubic inch engine that made 340 horsepower. Again, the car was not overly fast, but certainly had plenty of acceleration, which got even better with the 472 cubic inch engine that came into the vehicle in the 1968 model year. The 67 Eldorado remains one of the most timeless and stunning Cadillac designs of all time, and it continues to influence Cadillac styling to this day. Let's move on to the final vehicle in our lineup, and that is the 1976 Cadillac Seville. Introduced midway through the 1975 model year as a 1976 model, the 76 Seville was Cadillac's response to European luxury imports taking increasing amounts of market share, particularly on the west coast of the U.S. Cadillacs had become so large by this point that it was sometimes hard for them to even fit in owners' garages, and many owners were clamoring for something that was smaller and more European in taste. Thus, Cadillac started performing some market surveys and tests on particular vehicles that had downsized proportions to see if the public as well as dealers would be accepting of them. One thought early on in the program's development for the 76 Seville was for GM to rebadge an Opel Diplomat from Germany, and in some cases modify the sheet metal slightly so that it had some Cadillac styling cues. However, it was soon decided that a rebadged Opel was not going to cut the mustard here in the United States, and Cadillac effectively stretched a Chevrolet Nova chassis to create the Seville. While it sounds like that this wouldn't be a successful endeavor, the truth is that the 76 Sevilles actually had great ride and handling as well as interior quietness. They also introduced the so-called General Motors sheer look styling with sharp angular forms that differed significantly from the rounded forms of the previous generation Cadillacs. Like it or not, the 76 Seville set the styling trend for General Motors and the industry all the way up until the 1986 Ford Taurus was introduced and more organic forms became commonplace on cars. In fact, the Seville proved to be so much of a success that many cars copied its styling, and almost every General Motors car in the 1980s era had some form of the Seville's vertical backlight and formal roofline. I do believe, however, that one of the last vehicles that employed the Seville's very angular styling was the 1993 Dodge Dynasty, where not only was the exterior very angular in form, but the interior was as well, particularly the gauges. I suppose that the design team was a bit unhappy that they had to use round wheels on the car. In any case, the 1976 Seville and its extremely clean styling set the trend for automotive design for at least the next decade. And in fact, one of the most successful cars to employ the Seville styling was the 1977 Chevrolet Caprice and Impala, which soldiered on all the way until the 1990s as a mainstream vehicle for Chevrolet. That just proves the lasting significance of this design philosophy that the Seville kicked off. Hope you enjoyed this series on automotive design. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.